Good morning. Thank you for coming. I want to thank the Center for Constitutional Studies for inviting me to come to beautiful Utah and participate in this conference. I also want to thank Professor Andrew Bibby and my old colleague, Professor Scott, for their hospitality. Today I would like to talk about James Madison's reflections upon federalism in the months prior to the Federal Convention in Philadelphia. My premise is that we can gain valuable insights into the origins of the American idea of federalism by examining this seminal framer's thoughts on the subject as he prepared for the convention in the summer of 1787. But before I turn to Madison, I want to say a few words about the overarching historical and intellectual context of thinking about federalism in the founding period. Arguably, there were two major aims of the American framers in this period. First, to establish constitutional government compatible with the requirements of republicanism, and second, the creation of constitutional government consistent with the principle of federalism. No doubt, they discovered a complex relation between republicanism and federalism, but of the two goals, I would submit that the imperative toward federalism was the tougher of the two tasks. The reason is that the Americans already had a respectable prototype for Republican separation of powers in an admittedly idealized version of the British Constitution. With respect to federalism, however, the source material for Americans was more arcane and the benefits less tangible. In some sense, federalism in America was simply the inevitable product of the British imperial structure of North America. Distinct autonomous polities on the periphery, bound to the center in a complex legal arrangement, was as much or more a part of the American inheritance from the British Empire as constitutional monarchy. That is to say, republicanism and federalism presented the problem of founding in terms of the obverse relation between preserving what is as well as creating anew. But even if the practical reality of federalism was impossible to ignore, thinking about federalism was still quite rudimentary in colonial America. Apart from Ben Franklin's Albany Plan of Union of 1754 and Tom Paine's outline of a colonial charter in the closing section of Common Sense, there was not a great deal of sophisticated federal theory for Madison to ruminate upon. The one exception, of course, would be Montesquieu, who offered some historical reflection on confederacies in Book 9 of his magisterial Spirit of the Laws. In fact, you could argue, as I have tried, that Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, taken in its totality, presented a complex vision of a system of multi-level governance that attempted to weave together a horizontal separation of powers, a la the British Constitution, with a vertical division of power based upon the historical practices of local and regional self-government in the Gothic Constitution of pre-modern Ancien Regime France. Montesquieu, of course, would never live to see this potentially regime-saving federal reform in France, as French revolutionary thought would turn out to be deeply hostile to the idea of federalism. My point is that prior to 1786-87 period, the only actual model of federalism available to Madison was as an inheritance of British imperialism, more or less crystallized in the by then clearly struggling Articles of Confederation. I want to identify Madison's research on the history and practice of federalism as the pivotal moment in the evolution of American federalism in the founding period. It was during his preparation and reading for the convention that Madison thought more deeply about federalism than perhaps anyone of his time, and it was these reflections that would leave an enormous mark on the Constitution produced in Philadelphia. During the course of 1786 and early 1787, James Madison wrote a series of short reflection papers based upon his historical research and his assessment of the American political experience under the Articles of Confederation. The writings I want to focus on today are Madison's Notes on Ancient and Modern Confederacies from the spring of 1786, and his Vices of the Political System of the United States, and his letter to George Washington, both from the spring of 1787. The questions Madison grappled with in this period get to the heart of the complex relation between federalism and the founding. Is federalism simply a necessary evil, a legacy of imperial governance, or is there a deeper philosophical commitment to an idea of political liberty only possible in a federal state with some integration of small homogeneous republics? In addition, can the principle of federalism be integrated into a Republican separation of powers, and are there advantages to doing so that are not available to a unitary Republican government? These questions were to guide Madison's studies at this time. Before we turn to Madison's text, let's briefly recall the main features of the Articles of Confederation, the replacement of which Madison's research was directed. The Articles were the Constitution that governed the United States during the Revolutionary War, most of it, and its immediate aftermath. It created a national government that was unicameral, had a weak plural executive, and to which there were no direct elections. All members of the National Congress were appointed by their state legislatures. Article 2 boldly stated that, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, unquote, as each state delegation represented a single vote in Congress. The firm League of Friendship left the national government with no power to either directly raise revenue or to raise an army or to legislate for individual citizens in the states. That is, the U.S. government under the Articles was very much a creature of the state governments. In ancient and modern confederacies drafted in the spring of 1786, Madison reflected upon a broad survey of historical examples of confederated polities. This research served both as an instrument of critique towards the existing Articles, but also as a blueprint for a positive vision of a distinctively American version of federalism. Among the several confederacies he considered, 3 of them stand out, in my opinion: the Lycian Confederacy, the Amphictyonic League, and the Dutch or Belgic Confederacy. The Lycian Confederacy of cities of ancient southern Turkey is most notable as Montesquieu's preferred choice for a confederacy. It had a relatively strong central government in which representation was based on a city's size and wealth. Smaller cities were not truly self-governing because their administration was appointed by this general authority. This would be the equivalent of the government of Massachusetts or Virginia having more to do with the election of the governor of Delaware than the people of Delaware themselves. Madison is critical of the Lycian model, arguing that it's not really a federal republic at all, because a proper federal system requires at least a minimal degree of self-government for its constituent parts. With this, Madison signaled his indebtedness to, but also his break from Montesquieu. The Amphictyonic League was a defensive alliance centered in the ancient Greek city of Delphi. And each city was represented equally with 2 votes in the League Council. While the League had no system of uniform legislation, it did go beyond the American Articles of Confederation by providing for a centralized military force capable of exercising coercive power against the member cities. Madison judges that despite its official commitment to the equality of its members, the Amphictyonic League suffered from functional inequality, as big cities bullied smaller cities, given delegates were directly tied to their home city and could not be impartial judges. Also, the military alliance failed because in reality, the members were not willing to defend each other. If the Lycian Confederacy was inadequate because it gave up on the idea of federalism, then we could say the Amphictyonic League failed because while retaining federalism, it was not effective. The major modern confederacy that Madison considered was that of the United Provinces created by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1579. The 9 provinces formed a national states general in which each province had 1 vote, and the terms of office of representatives was determined by the government of the home province. The grand pensioner of the largest province, Holland, served as a kind of unofficial prime minister. Each province retained its sovereignty except with respect to declaring war and peace, establishing treaties, or imposing duties on trade with other provinces. Any measure of general taxation required unanimous approval of all provinces, and any amendment to the Constitution created by the Treaty of Utrecht required unanimous consent. Madison judged that unlike the Lycian Confederacy, the United Dutch Provinces has proven to be an effective military alliance, primarily directed against France. The real source of strength, however, lies in the office of the stadtholder, who is not a king, but a hereditary prince attached to the House of Orange. The stadtholder is a military commander with immense prerogatives who is crucially not attached to a particular city or province's delegation. Stadtholder is a kind of executive officer who can make the interests of the Union felt within each part of the Federation. Madison assesses that the Stadtholder is effective, but heredity is incompatible with republicanism. His main takeaway from the Dutch example is that the main agent of union must have a sense of agency independent from the union. So the question then is how to achieve this independent agency in a way that's still compatible with republicanism. The second lesson from the Dutch example is Madison's conclusion that there must be found some way for the agents of the Union to act within the member states. Madison's later proposal to include a national government veto, which we'll hear more about later, over state legislation, the Virginia Plan, is an attempt to replicate a Republican equivalent to the Stadtholder's role. From comparative historical study, Madison later turned to critical analysis of the American experience of constitutionalism since the Revolutionary War. In the spring of 1787, Madison penned his Vices of the Political System of the United States. The parallel between this and his earlier historical study of confederacies is quite clear. The problems of the Articles are essentially the problem of modern confederacies as such. Madison listed a dozen or so major vices of the Articles, but these, in my view, really reduce to three kinds of flaws. There is the vice of performance failures, according to which the state governments refuse to pay or delay paying requisitions to the national government, and when the states frequently fail to honor treaties made by the United States. These are sins of omission. The second major kind of vices are encroachment failures, by which the state governments are doing things they are not supposed to do, especially interfering with each other by imposing duties on trade. These are sins of commission. The third kind of vice Madison identifies are opportunity costs, or things that could be done to benefit the entire country if only there was a functioning national government. For instance, under the Articles, there is no federal government to make internal improvements or to even guarantee the Republican form of government to each of the member states. The former problem would, of course, be addressed in the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8, and the latter in Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. The overarching themes of Madison's criticism of the Articles related to the centrifugal forces in America, which he felt were even more powerful than in the Dutch United Provinces, and perhaps most importantly, his conclusion that the state governments have shown themselves to be unstable and unjust, meaning private rights are in danger in most of the American states in absence of a national government to defend them. In his letter to George Washington, also written in April 1787, at the same time as he was composing the Vices of the Political System of the United States, Madison emphasized that another major vice of the Articles is that it was not ratified by the people in all of the states, but only in some of them. The result is that in some states, the article is only one state law among many because it bears no special authorization from the sovereign people. As such, state laws which have been authorized by the people assume a kind of moral priority over national constitution. It's here in the letter to Washington that Madison first formulated his vision of a federal republic that involves neither pure consolidation nor pure confederacy. Pure consolidation would be incompatible with American political traditions and, frankly, the British colonial legacy. On a more theoretical level, pure consolidation would repudiate the principle that both the state and federal governments reflect popular sovereignty. Madison's rejection of pure confederacy in this letter is more complicated. He argues, first of all, that federalism must reject the perfect equality of states as in the Articles. As a matter of representation, this would mean excluding as much as possible the state legislatures having any role in the national government. Madison further concludes that the national government should have, quote, positive and complete, unquote, authority in everything that requires uniformity, such as taxes, trade, defense, and naturalization. Most importantly, Madison took this opportunity to provide Washington with a general outline of what he called the national government's veto, or the negative in all cases whatsoever on the legislative acts of the states, as heretofore expressed by kingly power. So Madison expressly connects the universal negative with kingly power. Madison emphasized to the future first president that this national veto of state legislation was absolutely necessary to make a federal republic truly work. Why did Madison feel that the national legislative veto was so important? The main reason was that the traditional mixed regime was not available as a solution to the problem of unjust government in America. Hereditary families and unelected officials with no popular role in their appointment would be simply inconsistent with the spirit of the American Revolution and with the American people. So, the problem is there seems to be no internal or external restraints on unjust government without recourse to non-Republican elements that are illegitimate. The national legislative veto was Madison's attempt to combine legitimacy and effectiveness by giving traditional monarchical power to a federal government with a certain distance from the state governments so that the national government could act in the interest of the whole. The key is that it is not a consolidated national government with sole positive legislative power, like the British Parliament with legislative supremacy, but rather a negative power ensuring the national government is woven into the fabric of the legislative process in each state. It was only later in Federalist Number 10 that Madison would explain why he believed a national majority would be more disinterested than state legislatures. But by then, of course, his national legislative negative would have been rejected by the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I would like to conclude with a few brief remarks about Madison's legacy with regard to the emerging American idea of federalism in the founding period. Perhaps Madison's greatest achievement was to conceptualize a new idea of federalism that is, as he put it, neither pure consolidation nor pure confederation. Madison's research in the months prior to the convention led him to conclude that in the American context, a mixture of national and federal elements is federalism. Madison envisioned an idea of federalism that is a flexible, innovative concept that produces political arrangements that are in principle subject to renegotiation, constant renegotiation. Was the Virginia Plan primarily authored by Madison and proposed at the start of the convention in Philadelphia a wholly nationalist program, as some scholars such as Martin Diamond and Jack Rakoff concluded? It's certainly nationalist compared to the Articles of Confederation, but it's not simply nationalist per se. Rather, it reflects Madison's new thinking about federalism as a mixture. It is nationalist with respect to the power base in the proportionally elected lower house of the national legislature, and with respect to the relative exclusion of state governments to the margins of the national legislature. The national legislative negative, which gave the national government the power to strike down state laws, was also decidedly nationalist, as it allowed the national government to effectively operate within the legislative process of each state with a kind of judicial review function. But even the Virginia Plan is still federal because of the parallel and separate character of the national and state governments. That is to say, the state governments do not exist at the discretion of the national government. Perhaps the fruition of Madison's reflections upon federalism in the founding period most clearly manifests in his argument in Federalist Paper number 39. Here he defended the new Constitution against opponents by arguing that the Federal Republic is, quote, in strictest neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both, unquote. How did Madison formulate this compound structure? First, he claimed that while the Constitution was ratified by the people, not the state governments, the people were understood as comprising the distinct and independent states to which they belong. The same principle of combination can be seen in the national legislature, in which the lower house upheld the principle of proportional representation, i.e. a national principle, while the Senate accepted the states as political and co-equal societies. Likewise, while the national legislative power is a consolidated national power that is the supreme legislature in the land, the United States Constitution, according to Madison, also stipulates that the national legislature's jurisdiction extends to certain objects only, leaving the state governments to their own jurisdictional sphere. Finally, we see the principle of mixture in the executive branch, in which the Electoral College reflects the federal principle, even as the impeachment power includes modalities that are primarily national, the House majority vote to impeach, and powers primarily federal, namely the Senate's two-thirds vote for removal of a president. In conclusion, while there is no doubt that the United States Constitution, which produced arguably the first modern federal republic, was the product of extensive negotiation and compromise involving many powerful minds, I hope I've been able to convince you that James Madison's reflections on federalism in the months prior to the convention is certainly one of the major formative influences. Thank you.